Hello and welcome to the Legal Edition. I'm your host, Attorney Mary Kay Elloian. Our show topic is From Rites to Remedies, How Homeopathic Medicine Has Saved Lives During Global Pandemics. Our guest is Dr. Richard Moskowitz. He is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate from Harvard College with a focus in biochemical sciences. He received his medical degree from New York University School of Medicine in New York City. For nearly 50 years, Dr. Moskowitz has been a physician and homeopathic practitioner. He has authored numerous books on the efficacy of homeopathic treatments and cures. Let's welcome Dr. Moskowitz. Welcome, Dr. Moskowitz.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure having you. Dr. Moskowitz, could you explain to the audience what is homeopathy?
Well, in 25 words or less. Basically, it's a form of natural medicine that involves the use of highly diluted substances that, instead of opposing the symptoms of the patient as we do in regular medicine, we go with the symptoms. That is to say, we regard the symptoms as the attempt of the organism to overcome whatever it's trying to overcome. And we've discovered that by giving a remedy that has the power in crude form, in high dose, to produce the symptoms that the patient has, will help to relieve those symptoms in a microscopic dose. And this has been used now for over 200 years. And it's quite effective. It's very gentle. And the homeopathic remedies have been licensed by the Food and Drug Administration since 1938, and they're in use all over the world. It's practiced by physicians and other health practitioners in many, many countries on every continent.
So it's extremely safe, I understand.
It's very safe because the doses are so small that the remedy can only work if it's the right one for the patient. Otherwise, if the patient doesn't have a sensitivity to it, it won't work at all, and very little is going to happen. So it's a tremendous safety feature. And indeed,
excuse me, so unlike allopathic medicine, which has numerous side effects,
right,
you're saying that this one has absolutely, virtually no side effects?
Well, I won't say none. I mean, it's just that, you know, they're not really side effects, because instead of giving the drug for a part of the patient, for the particular abnormality that we're trying to correct, homeopathy gives the whole of the remedy to the whole of the patient. But because it engenders a self-healing process when it's selected properly, we can't predict precisely how that's going to go. That is, there may be symptoms that occur in the course of the treatment that the patient had long ago, for example. In a few cases, it may produce new symptoms, and it's usually a sign that the remedy is working, and it's perfectly okay. But I can't say that there are no side effects. I just wouldn't call them side effects. Mm-hmm. And the chances that something untoward is going to happen are very, very small. Mm-hmm. The safety record is so excellent indeed that I think most of my learned colleagues fondly believe that what I give are sugar pills.
I have read that.
Which indeed they are. Yeah. That is, if a chemist were to analyze them, all he would find would be sugar, because that's the vehicle that we use to convey the medicine, which is diluted past the point where it can have any molecular existence, really.
But nonetheless, effectiveness.
It's quite effective when it's properly chosen. That's the trick. That the whole point of homeopathy is to individualize the choice of the remedy to the patient, the individuality of that patient.
And the symptomology.
Yes. But it's the symptoms that the patient shows. It's not so much the abstract disease that the patient happens to illustrate. That's what we use in regular medicine, because we have a different concept of causality. We're giving a drug which will force the blood pressure down, regardless of whether the patient is tall or short or
you mean
happy.
allopathic medicine?
Yes, exactly. That's the kind of causality that we're interested in, where you give the drug and bang, the blood pressure is coming down, no matter what the individuality of the patient is. Whereas in homeopathy, if we don't find a remedy to which the patient is highly sensitive, it won't work at all. Mm-hmm. So this is the safety factor, exactly.
Mm-hmm. And there's also ways to negate a remedy as well, as I have heard.
Yes,
as well.
but it's very seldom that you need to do that.
But it's there.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, what types of illnesses or diseases have been cured over the centuries?
Many, many, many. I mean, I practice homeopathic medicine only. That's the only form of treatment that I offer.
Even though you are a medical doctor
yes,
as
I'm
well.
a medical doctor, but I don't write prescriptions and I don't do any surgery. So when a patient comes to me, basically I'm going to give them some advice perhaps, or some counseling or education about their illness, and then I'm going to give them homeopathic remedies to try to help them along their path, to try to help them heal themselves naturally without drugs that will compel their organism to do something. So that's the difference in a nutshell, that conventional medicine gives drugs to compel the organism to correct whatever abnormalities we find and that we're interested in correcting. Whereas homeopathy is something that's, when it's chosen properly, we want to help the individual to heal themselves.
From the inside out.
From the inside.
From the out. Now, I've done quite a bit of research on this issue, and I found that there is, over the years, and actually over the centuries, Hahnemann was the first doctor to establish this. Could you elaborate?
Yes, Hahnemann was a very well trained, very well respected medical doctor in Germany. He started practice toward the end of the 18th century, in the late 1700s, and he became quite disgusted with medical practice. He felt that it was too strong, that the patient was more likely to die of the medicine than he was from the illness that the medicine was used for. It's a problem that we still have, by the way.
We see today with many of the side effects from conventional medicine.
Many of the things that he said were prophetic about the medical system today. But so he began to translate to make a living. He was quite a scholar and he knew many languages, so he began translating medical works from various languages into German, and one of the works he came upon was a Materia Medica by the Scottish physician William Cullen, I'm sorry, and he found a passage in there that was curious, that struck him as curious. He said quinine bark, which was just being introduced into European medicine at that time, was powerful against fevers because it was an astringent. It had a bitter taste, and Hahnemann thought that was ridiculous. So for some reason, he decided to take a dose of the medicine himself. And much to his great amazement, it produced in him a paroxysm of fever and chills and bone aches that was very similar to what the drug was being used to treat. Mm-hmm. And this was so amazing to him that he let the drug wear off, and then he took another dose. And by the way, he was an expert in pharmacology. In fact, he had written a standard textbook of the preparation of the standard medicines of that time.
Mm-hmm. As I understand, Hippocrates, way back, was the first to delve into this issue, and Hahnemann carried that further.
Yes, Hippocrates mentioned, in the Hippocratic writings, there are several references to like curing like, to using something which can produce symptoms to cure those symptoms. But for the Hippocratic writings, it was one method among many. It wasn't the only one. Hahnemann was the first one who developed it into a system of healing, where he believed that was the only way for true healing to take place. And so he was so struck by this coincidence that he had discovered that he began to test other medicines of his time systematically by administering them in therapeutic doses to himself, his friends, his family, anybody that he could beg, borrow, or steal for these experiments. He, in this fashion, he proved over 90 medicines in his own lifetime, which is an incredible task, because each proving took many, many weeks and months. And then he had to record very minutely what the symptoms of each medicine was, and then to start employing them in treatment. So he, at that point, was very excited and went back into practice. And he became famous throughout Europe. In fact, the thing that really made him famous was a scarlet fever epidemic that happened in 1799 in some... It started in some rural part of Germany, and he developed a method of approaching this epidemic as a whole. That I just told you that homeopathy treats the patient as an individual, uniquely, each one. But an epidemic disease, it stamps itself on almost everybody who gets it with very much the same set of symptoms, almost like a waffle iron, you know.
The same DNA footprint, is that correct?
Well, regardless of the cause, I mean, the result is that most people have the same range of symptoms pretty much. But what Hahnemann was inspired to do was he took the case of the epidemic, that was the individual. So he took maybe, after he had taken 25 cases, let's say, of people who had scarlet fever, he determined that the remedy belladonna, which we still use in medicine today, in regular medicine, was the medicine that corresponded most closely to the symptoms of that epidemic in most people. And he found that by giving them diluted, highly diluted belladonna, he was able to cure a large majority of those patients. But then he went even further, and he discovered that by giving small doses of belladonna who were being exposed or who were in danger of... Prophylactically, yes, that those people had a much lower incidence of the disease, and when they did get it, it was much less serious. So that was what made him famous. He became a celebrity almost overnight. In that, it was at first in a small part of Germany, but the epidemic spread quite widely throughout that region, and so he became famous. And that method of individualizing the epidemic and finding what we call the genus epidemicus, the remedy that corresponds to that particular outbreak, has been proven over and over again in history, in scarlet fever, in cholera, in typhus, in influenza.
And the Spanish influenza of 1918 was one of those.
Yes. Yes, it was used very successfully in treating that epidemic. And what's fascinating to me is that it never made the newspapers. Or why did that not become...
One would ask why, when something so miraculous
yes.
had not been investigated by the media.
And I read a very detailed, exhaustive, and really, in many ways, fine account of the 1918 epidemic recently. And the author mentioned that there was homeopathic treatment, and he poo-pooed it. He just said, essentially, I can't believe in those statistics. They don't add up to me. In other words, this is what people have said ever since Hahnemann's time, that homeopathy can't possibly work, therefore it doesn't work.
It's sort of like we don't have climate change when we do.
Yeah, something like
akin to that.
So there was a lot of self-censorship on the part of the media, as there still is today.
Yes, there is. Well, the question, I guess, becomes, what is the percentage of success that homeopathy has over allopathic medicine, in today's genre?
Well, I would say it's very, very good. It's inexpensive, it's safe, and the track record is quite excellent. Let's put it this way. I've been practicing nothing but homeopathy for over 40 years without ever writing a prescription. It's been enough to sustain me in a general practice for all that time without needing to write a prescription. And that's been true of many, many doctors throughout the world. So the problem is that it's such a controversial idea. I can understand why people are slow to accept it, because you're asking them to believe that a remedy which has been diluted beyond the point of Avogadro's number, such that there's no molecular substance anymore. It's just a vibration that sounds like a hippie concept, you know?
But the royal family has
Yes.
been using these remedies, including the Queen of England,
Absolutely.
who is doing marvelous for her age, has been using them for hundreds of years, have
Well,
they not?
yes, the royal family, the British royal family has sponsored homeopathic medicine in Britain for over 150 years. And they have, the Queen and every British ruler has his or her official homeopathic physician. That's part of an important part of their healing team.
And unlike the U.S., they also have homeopathic hospitals.
They do. Now, of course, there were a number of homeopathic hospitals in the United States, too. In the late 1800s, the United States was the world capital of homeopathic medicine. Yes, absolutely. Some of the great masters of history, who are still revered and read and studied by people all over the world, were from the United States.
So what happened, Dr. Moskowitz?
What happened was that they were sort of outgunned by the industrial apparatus of modern medicine that emerged after the Civil War. The drug companies became very powerful, and they influenced American medicine very, very much. So even though there were many, many homeopathic physicians, people who called themselves homeopathic physicians in the late 1800s, in practice, the number of people who practiced pure Hahnemannian homeopathy was always very small. And they didn't keep up with the developments of the Industrial Revolution. That is to say, homeopathic treatment requires you to spend time with the patient. You have to individualize each patient. Whereas in conventional medicine, the pressure was to see more and more
patients in a certain amount of time.
So you could say
Maximize
this patient is a
profits.
specimen of scarlet fever, and this patient is a specimen of this disease and that disease and the other disease. So yes, exactly, that you treat all of those patients the same. Whereas in homeopathy, you might have 10 patients with pneumonia, they might get 10 different remedies. You have to see them carefully, each one.
And you spend more time with them.
And you spend much more time with them.
Which is not cost effective for the large medical establishments.
Plus the fact that you had tremendous development in things like surgery, where we became very expert in taking out people's organs and in repairing them when they were broken or injured. And I don't mean to belittle that by any means. It's a tremendous feat, but
it has its place.
Yes. There were tremendous technological developments in medicine that homeopathy really didn't participate in. They were they had their method, and it continued. I mean, the method is essentially now the way that Hahnemann practiced it 200 years ago. So whereas modern medicine thrives on a diet of constant change, the principles of homeopathy haven't changed.
Now let's move on to issues like Ebola. There's a lot of consensus about that it's a very highly contagious disease, and people should be quarantined. There's been news about, people being put in rooms in solitary confinement. It's happened. There's even a U.S. code about it, the U.S. Code, Title 42, Public Health and Welfare. And so there's a lot of issues in the news today, hear every day about new outbreaks. And one of the questions I have, and they're blaming a lot of these outbreaks on unvaccinated children, but the reality is the people that were actually vaccinated are getting the disease. How do you explain that?
Well, let me just say this, first of all, that argument that the reason that these diseases are continuing is because of unvaccinated people, that doesn't make really a lot of sense if you think about it, because if the vaccine is so bloody good, then what's the problem? Then the unvaccinated kids are a danger only to themselves. So if the vaccinated people are also getting it, then that says that the vaccine isn't any good. So you can't have it both ways. So we need to ask that question a little more carefully.
Exactly. Now, from what I've read, homeopathy treats not only viruses but bacterial infections.
Oh, absolutely.
So treating Ebola potentially homeopathically is a viable solution, is it not?
Yes, it is. But with Ebola, there are other factors that have to be taken into account. First of all, it's very contagious, but it's not as contagious as a disease like
common cold,
the measles, for example. I mean, the measles. If you're sneezing and somebody's sitting across the room from you, there's a good chance that they will get it, that they will acquire it. Whereas with Ebola, you have to touch the person,
physical contact,
or very close at least. I mean, if they coughed up something right on you, some sputum or something, then you could get it even if you were sitting, say, that far away as you are now from me. But it's not nearly as contagious as a disease like the measles. So one of the big problems with a disease like Ebola is the collapse of the public health system in those countries. They're so poor that they just don't have the ability to cope. And they also have a folklore that says that you should bury the bodies in such a way, and you should kiss the victims. And
so they're just spreading it even more.
They're just spreading. So these are public health issues.
Right.
So no method of treatment is going to help until that is rectified.
But prophylactically, too,
yes.
There can be some treatments.
Yes. In fact, there are some Cuban doctors over in West Africa right as we speak who are not only treating Ebola with homeopathy, but are developing a no-so, that is a homeopathic remedy from the virus itself.
The disease organism.
Yes, and that has great promise for use prophylactically for some people in the area. Even before you do the rigmarole that I described, where you individualize, you take the case of the epidemic, and some people have done that from their armchairs in a very speculative way and said, just based on the symptoms, there are these remedies that might well help it, and that's true. But there are other things that could be done, even allopathically, that are not being done. For example,
and in combination with homeopathy.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the serum of the cured patients, this doctor who's going back there now, his blood would be tremendously powerful,
antigen.
Essentially homeopathic treatment of Ebola. But of course there aren't enough of such to go around at the moment. But I believe these Cuban doctors are going to achieve something by preparing that no-so.
And this is not happening in this country. This is happening in Cuba.
No, in fact, there was a mission. The European and American homeopaths sponsored a mission to West Africa of some physicians who were very well trained, who wanted to treat Ebola patients, and the World Health Organization put the kibosh on it. They wouldn't let them do it. But what they did do is they started working in the hospital at the request of the ministries of health of those governments, working on the other patients. They had tremendous results.
So prophylactically, they protected those other patients.
Well, maybe. I mean, they were treating them for other sicknesses, is my point.
I see.
And, and so informally they had wonderful results, but they were prohibited from treating the Ebola patients. So that's politics.
Yes, it sure is politics. So what you're saying is we've had a tremendous success in this country early on, in early years,
yes.
prior to the advent of the large pharmaceutical companies
yes.
and antibiotics, which thus came on the market. But these treatments are still quite viable and used overseas, in India,
yes,
Europe.
very much so. And they're still used. I mean, I've used them in my own practice. We have a flu epidemic every year, so I see some dozens of patients with the flu every year, and I do the method that I just described, and it works beautifully.
Can you do it preventively so one won't
absolutely
get the flu?
Yeah, sure. Once I've seen 20 patients, or my colleagues have, then we can figure out what the remedy for that epidemic is, and then we can give it out prophylactically. The only problem is that the flu virus is very mutable, so it can change very quickly, and that's why the people who make the vaccines have to make it every year, and they're usually a year behind. They're still fighting the last war, so to speak.
So it sounds it's much more viable to go to a homeopathic practitioner and get treated prophylactically for the virus strain that is actually infecting everyone.
Yeah, or treating it in an actual patient. I mean, it's very effective.
And you minimize the symptomology.
Yes.
Now, there's so much controversy these days and about, again, childhood vaccinations and it not working. But again, what I'm seeing is it's not the children that are unvaccinated. It's, again, those people that have had the vaccines, in fact, multiple vaccines, which can be linked to numerous other disorders.
Yes, that's certainly.
What have you seen?
Well, I see this every day of the week. I'll give you a perfect example. A couple of examples. I'm treating a kid, let's say, for ear infections, which is very, very common. I see them all the time, and we're doing homeopathic remedies, and we're doing beautifully. The kid isn't getting ear infections, and the pediatrician is thrilled, and the parents are delighted. And then it's time for booster X, and it could be a pneumococcus, it could be a Hib, it could be an MMR, it could be a DPT, could be a flu shot, you name it. And within 2 weeks, we're right back to square one, and the kid gets his ear infections again. We have to start all over again. So here's another example, and this makes the point even better. I saw this one child who had had ear infections since she was 3 months old. She'd had at least 10 courses of antibiotics by the time she was 15 months old. Okay, and the first one that she had at 3 months was a high fever, 104, screaming with earache, and then they gave her the antibiotic, and then it came back a month later, and they did it again. But by then she just had a little bit of a fever and not much earache and just a little fussy. And sometimes it was just discovered by the pediatrician on a routine exam. There was nothing wrong with the child, but they found some fluid behind the drum, so they treated it as an ear infection. So I gave the child a homeopathic medicine, and within 2 weeks, she got a high fever of 104, just like that very first episode. I treated it with homeopathic medicine, and then she never had another one.
She was cured.
She was cured.
Unbelievable.
But what that says, what's so important about that, is that the programming of the immune system is to learn how to respond acutely and vigorously to infection, and so with a fever, that's the signal.
Fever is a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
It's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be bad if it's prolonged, if it's very high, and so on. But basically, that's the mechanism that the immune system uses to develop a vigorous response to infection.
Well,
whereas with a vaccine, it's a chronic phenomenon. That is, you introduce it into the body, into the main cells of the immune system without any way of getting rid of it. So it just sits there in the immune system. We get these antibodies, but it's a chronic response. It's meant to be a chronic response so that the person will continue to make antibodies against it. But my experience has been that it favors chronic responses generally, so that the ear infection became a chronic one, and then when I gave the homeopathic remedy, it reverted to the acute, and then it was cured, you see.
I see. So, and that child is doing well now?
Yeah. 4 years later,
Unbelievable.
The child never had another ear infection. They're totally fine. There's not a problem.
Because you treated it systemically.
And so you could substitute for that asthma or eczema or ADD or you name it. The whole gamut of modern pediatrics, and I've seen the same thing happen.
That's unbelievable. Now, where can someone find a homeopathic physician? Because people all across the country, is there a website that they can go to?
There are a couple of websites. The first one is the American Institute of Homeopathy, and that one is www.homeopathyyusa.org. And the second one is the National Center for Homeopathy, which is, I forget what that one is, but...
Is it the National Center for Homeopathy.org as well?
It may well be.
I
think it is. But they maintain a database all over the country, as does the American Institute. The National Center also lists practitioners who are not MDs, who are nurse practitioners or whatever, who are also practicing homeopathy. So that's a good one.
That's great. And you've written 2 books. You've written More Doctoring, and then you've written Plain Doctoring.
Yes, those are my 2 recent ones. I have 2 books before that. I have one, Homeopathic Medicines for Pregnancy and Childbirth, which was from my earlier home birth period, and then Resonance, the Homeopathic Point of View, which is really a treatise for a general reader about what homeopathy is, how we think about health and illness as homeopathic doctors. These 2 are collections of articles that I've written, some excerpts from those two other books, but so these are just collected writings.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And your website is?
www.Dr. written out DOCTOR and then another R, Dr. R Mosk MOSK.com.
Well, it's great. Well, it's been a pleasure having this conversation. It's been very, very informative, and I want to thank you again for coming.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
I want to thank our guest, Dr. Richard Moskowitz, for sharing his information and insights on homeopathy and allopathic medicine. I also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. For more information on today's topic and our guests, please visit The Legal Edition online at thelegaledition.com. And as always, this information is for general educational purposes only. It is not to be construed or relied upon as legal, business, or medical advice. And please consult a qualified practitioner as to your particular legal, business, or medical needs. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time for more of The Legal Edition.